Nurses like Walsh are why we need mandatory retirement ages. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 43 minutes before a Black Hawk landed in his parking lot. Cedar Creek Medical's night shift hums with fluorescent buzz and antiseptic tang. The ICU breathes in synchronized rhythm, ventilators wheeze, monitors beep their steady 2-beat pulse, for pumps click with metronomic precision. Margaret Walsh moves through this landscape like water finding its path, her graying hair pulled into a tight bun, her hand steady as surgical steel. 52 years old. 15 years on the night shift at Cedar Creek. 15 years of changing dressings without complaint, administering medications without fanfare, holding dying people's hands at 2 in the morning when their families had gone home. She is the kind of nurse hospitals forget they have until she is not there. Her locker in the break room contains a pair of worn combat boots wrapped in plastic. They have never been worn since she placed them there. Nobody has ever asked about them. Nobody has ever asked about the surgical scar that crosses her left forearm in a jagged line, the kind of scar that comes from shrapnel, not scalpels. That scar is 14 years old. The boots are older than that. Room 347 holds an Army Ranger. His name is Jason Morrison. He arrived 3 days ago via medical evacuation from Fallujah, his chest wrapped in field dressings that had already begun to deteriorate, his eyes unfocused from pain medication, his chart reading like a catalogue of shrapnel wounds. Chest trauma. Blast fragmentation. Suspected lung penetration. The surgeons had argued about whether he was even salvageable. Dr. Chen from trauma surgery had said his vitals would stabilize in 72 hours or he would code. Margaret had changed his dressings that first night and said nothing. The monitors above his bed display vital signs in glowing numbers. Heart rate 82. Blood pressure 118/76. O2 saturation 94%. Stable. Margaret stands beside his bed at 2:04 a.m. during her final rounds before shift change, studying the chest dressing with the clinical eye of someone who has wrapped wounds that had no business surviving. The standard gauze wrapping is adequate but not ideal for shrapnel trauma. The 3-layer technique, moisture barrier, absorption layer, protective compression, requires more time than most nurses carry in their shift. She begins to unwrap the standard dressing anyway, her fingers moving with unusual precision. The first layer releases with a soft whisper of tape giving way. The second layer follows. Then she sees what is underneath and something in her face does not change, but something in her hands does. They move differently now. Not with the careful deliberation of routine wound care but with the economy of motion that comes from muscle memory trained in field conditions. Margaret reaches for the sterile field and begins setting up a 3-layer dressing the way she has not done in 15 years. Moisture barrier, transparent film to prevent maceration of the surrounding tissue. Absorption layer, thick gauze with antimicrobial properties, packed specifically to manage the pattern of the shrapnel wound, accounting for depth and trajectory. Protective compression layer, conforming stretch bandage applied with tension calibrated for movement without restriction. The sequence takes her 12 minutes. Most nurses would take 8. The ranger's eyes snap open somewhere in the middle of the second layer. He watches her hands. Really watches them. His pupils focus for the first time in 3 days, tracking the motion of her fingers with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that matters. Only combat medics rap like that. His voice is barely a whisper, his throat raw from the breathing tube they removed yesterday. What unit were you with? Margaret does not pause. Her hands continue their work. The question hangs in the air of room 347 like something radioactive, something that should not be there, something that changes the pressure of the room itself. She finishes the final layer before answering. The dressing is flawless. Textbook perfect. The kind of perfect that comes from having saved lives with the same technique in conditions that had no textbooks. Just finishing your dressing, Ranger. You need rest. She moves to leave. She is pulling her gloves off, her face an expression of professional neutrality that gives nothing away. His voice is stronger now. Urgent. You know the compression ratio. The moisture barrier placement. That's not standard civilian training. That's not in any nursing school I've ever heard of. He pauses. His chest rises with shallow breaths, careful breaths, the kind you take when your ribs are wrapped around trauma. You served. It is not a question. Margaret stops. Her hands, still bare now, pause at the edge of the bed rail. The fluorescent light above them flickers once, a sound like a tiny electrical spark, almost inaudible, almost imperceptible. I've cared for a lot of rangers over the years, she says quietly. You pick up things. She leaves room 347 without waiting for a response. The machines continue their beeping. The ventilator in the adjacent room hisses its mechanical rhythm. And Jason Morrison, medically evacuated from Fallujah 3 days ago, stares at the ceiling and understands that the nurse who just dressed his wounds carries a classification that he was trained never to ask about. The break room smells like stale coffee and the particular staleness that comes from fluorescent-lit spaces that have never seen sunlight. Margaret stands at the vending machine at 2:31 a.m., feeding dollar bills into the slot with mechanical precision. It is her routine. 15 years of this routine. Vending machine coffee. 15 minutes. Back to work. The night shift is a study in small rituals that hold against the pressure of watching people die in increments. Dr. Whitfield arrives while she is reaching for her cup. He is wearing scrubs that cost more than Margaret's car payment, his white coat pressed into geometric angles, his credentials and his promotion and his father-in-law's influence arranged around him like armor. He has been chief of surgery at Cedar Creek Medical for 8 weeks. 8 weeks is enough time to have opinions about everyone who works here. Margaret has not yet warranted an opinion. He steps up to the vending machine beside her, close enough that she can smell the expensive cologne cutting through the antiseptic air. His phone is in his hand. He is looking at something on the screen, but he is also speaking, his voice carrying the particular certainty of someone accustomed to being heard. The issue with this institution, he says to his colleague who has materialized beside him with startling efficiency, is that we carry deadweight. Nurses like Walsh keep us from achieving teaching hospital status. Mandatory retirement ages exist for a reason. You reach 50, you lose the cognitive speed for advanced patient care. It's science. He glances sideways at Margaret without making eye contact. The system needs blood. Younger blood. Nurses who understand modernization. Margaret's jaw tightens. One muscle. Just one. The rest of her face remains perfectly composed. She takes her coffee from the machine and turns to leave. The mandatory retirement comment has not yet finished settling when Margaret presents herself at the supply cabinet on the ICU floor 20 minutes later. The supply cabinet that requires Dr. Whitfield's authorization for anything beyond basic wound care materials. She has written out a request on the proper form. 3-layer dressing supplies. Moisture barrier film. Antimicrobial absorption gauze. Compression bandages. Specific quantities. Professional language. The form sits in her hands like a diplomatic document. Dr. Whitfield is conducting an impromptu inspection of the ICU at 3:07 a.m. Margaret finds him standing outside room 347, reviewing the ranger's chart with the expression of someone calculating ROI on human damage. I need authorization for additional wound care supplies, she says. Standard protocol requires. He does not let her finish. His voice is sharp enough to cut, his eyes cold enough to freeze the fluorescent-lit air between them. What exactly are you planning to do that requires my personal authorization, Nurse Walsh? The standard dressing protocol in this hospital is established. Room 347's dressing is adequate. What you're suggesting is deviation from procedure. That is exactly the kind of initiative that leads to complications. It's for the Rangers' wound management. The current dressing protocol isn't optimal for shrapnel fragmentation patterns. A 3-layer technique would. Optimal. He laughs once, sharply, the sound like a knife hitting a tile floor. You understand that my job is to standardize care protocols, not to accommodate the instincts of night shift nurses who have been here longer than I've been breathing. You follow the protocol. You do not deviate. You do not improvise. Margaret stands very still. The ICU continues its beeping symphony around her. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor alarm sounds and then stops. Someone else's crisis. Not hers. Not yet. If you continue to request deviations from the established care protocols, he continues, his voice dropping to something quieter but somehow more dangerous, I will have hospital security escort you from this building. Do you understand? We have standards at Cedar Creek Medical. If you cannot follow them, we will find a nurse who can. He turns back to the chart. The conversation is over. Margaret is still standing there, the supply request form in her hands, her face a mask of professional neutrality that would give nothing away to anyone who did not know how to read the absence of emotion in a human being. She folds the form and places it back in her pocket. Understood, doctor. She does not add sir. She does not apologize. She simply walks back toward room 347 where Jason Morrison is waiting for his dressings to be changed with the wrong supplies and the right understanding that something about this nurse does not match any job description he has ever seen. The night continues. Margaret works through the remainder of her shift using standard protocol, standard supplies, standard care that is adequate but not optimal. The ranger's chart will be fine. His wound will heal. The protocol does not allow for better, but it allows for adequate, and adequate is what she will give him because that is what the hospital now permits. At 6:22 a.m., as the day's shift begins to arrive and Margaret begins her handoff notes, she stands beside Jason Morrison's bed one final time. His eyes are closed, he's breathing steady, his monitors displaying the vital signs of a man who will survive. The mistake Dr. Whitfield has already made is believing that Margaret Walsh is just a nurse. The Grand Rounds Amphitheater at Cedar Creek Medical filled with the sound of 30 medical residents settling into tiered seating, their white coats bright against the dark red chairs. Dr. Whitfield stood at the lecture podium, a presentation on documentation standards projected behind him, his silver cufflinks catching the overhead lights as he gestured with the precision of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Margaret Walsh sat at a back table updating charts, her pen moving with the steady rhythm of 15 years of night shifts, her graying hair pulled into its habitual bun, her posture curved slightly toward the paperwork as if the world beyond those pages didn't concern her. Whitfield was mid-sentence about contemporary charting protocols when his eyes found her. He stopped. The silence in the amphitheater shifted into something else, anticipation, the way a room feels when a predator has caught scent of prey. He walked to the back table. His footsteps echoed on the polished floor. This, he said, lifting Margaret's chart from the desk like contaminated evidence, his voice pitched for the entire room to hear, represents exactly what we're fighting against at Cedar Creek. He held the chart at arm's length between two fingers. Legacy incompetence. Outdated documentation practices that wouldn't pass muster at a real hospital. The residents laughed. Whispers rippled through the amphitheater. Whitfield continued, emboldened. Nurse Walsh here represents the old guard, adequate for battlefield triage perhaps, but we are a premier teaching institution now. We have standards. He set the chart down deliberately, as if placing something contaminated into biohazard waste. We have protocols. We don't have room for this. Margaret's jaw tightened. Imperceptible. The kind of tension you'd only catch if you were looking for it. She continued writing. Her pen didn't waver. Her eyes didn't lift from the page. She didn't acknowledge him with a word, a glance, or a shift in her posture. She simply continued her work as though Dr. Whitfield were a sound in the background, the hum of ventilation, the beep of monitors, something the body filters out automatically. Whitfield's smile faltered for half a second. He'd expected something. A flinch. An apology. Tears pooled in her eyes. Instead, Margaret's silence felt like a wall he'd thrown himself against. He turned back to the residents, but something had shifted in his expression. The confidence that had fueled his cruelty was replaced by something sharper, frustration masking as superiority. He returned to the podium and resumed his lecture, but his voice had lost its easy rhythm. Margaret turned a page in the chart. Her hands were steady as surgical steel. At 2 in the morning, the hospital fell into that particular quiet that only exists in the deepest hours, not peaceful, but predatory, the kind of silence where bad decisions are made because there's no one watching. Margaret fed quarters into the vending machine on the 3rd floor, watching the mechanical arm spiral and release a paper cup of black coffee. The machine dispensed the cup with a mechanical wheeze, and she retrieved it, fingers wrapped around the warmth. That Walsh woman is exactly the kind of deadweight dragging down our quality metrics. Dr. Whitfield's voice carried from the physician's lounge 15 feet away, his tone conversational, certain in its cruelty the way men are certain when they believe no one is listening who matters. I give her 3 months before I manufacture enough documentation to force her out. His colleague laughed, a nervous laugh, the kind that comes from someone uncomfortable but invested in maintaining status. Margaret's hand paused for exactly 1 second on the cup. Not a tremble. Not a shake. Just a pause, the way a predator pauses before deciding whether to strike or simply walk past. Then her hand continued steady. She retrieved her coffee and walked past the open lounge doorway without looking at either man. Her scrubs whispered against her legs. Her badge hung silent against her chest. She was a ghost they'd already forgotten. Room 347 held the Army Ranger from Fallujah, his chest wrapped in standard dressing that had been applied by the day shift, adequate, conventional, designed for ordinary wounds on ordinary bodies. Margaret entered at 11 p.m. with fresh supplies, her movements precise and efficient as she began to unwrap the old gauze. The ranger had been sedated earlier, but his eyes fluttered open as her hands worked, reading the fabric like a language he recognized. She applied a hemostatic gauze directly against the shrapnel wound, the kind that stops bleeding at the molecular level, designed specifically for combat injuries, then compressed trauma padding in a 3-layer sequence with occlusive tape sealed at 45-degree angles, each movement economical and practiced like hands that had done this 10,000 times before. The ranger's breathing quickened. Wait. His voice came out hoarse, rough from intubation. His eyes were fixed on her hands. That wrap pattern. 3-layer compressed seal with the tape at 45 degrees. Margaret's hands continued their work without pause. That's not standard protocol. The ranger's breathing accelerated. That's advanced tactical care. Special operations. His eyes snapped to her face. Only combat medics rap like that. What unit were you with? I'm just a night nurse, Sergeant Morrison. Her voice was quiet, the voice she'd cultivated over 15 years of invisibility. Been doing this 15 years. No. He gripped her wrist, surprisingly strong for a man 3 days out of surgery. I've worked with every branch. Marines, Army, Navy, Air Force rescue teams. That technique is JSOC protocol. That's Delta training. His eyes searched her face like someone trying to read a code. Who are you? Margaret gently removed his hand from her wrist and pressed it back to the bed rail. Someone who's trying to keep you alive, Sergeant. Now rest. But Morrison's brother had been in the waiting room for 72 hours straight, watching vitals reports tape-recorded by day shift nurses, hearing the attending physician use words like uncertain prognosis and quality of life considerations. The military liaison had visited that afternoon with news that sounded like a death sentence. Funding for Morrison's care would run out in the next 72 hours. The government was moving him to a VA facility in Allentown. The government was stepping back. Jason Morrison was not a violent man. He worked in construction. He had a daughter. He'd seen his brother take a bullet meant for his squad in Fallujah, and he'd carried his brother to the Humvee, and he'd held his brother's hand through 3 tours, and now his brother was dying in a hospital bed and nobody gave a shit. So at 2:47 in the morning, Jason Morrison walked past the nurse's station with a pistol tucked in his jacket, not a professional weapon, but a 9mm that had belonged to his father, and he carried it the way men carry weapons when they've stopped calculating consequences. The ICU doors opened without obstruction. Security was thin at this hour. The unit was quiet, just monitors beeping in rhythm, the hiss of ventilators keeping people alive who the government had already decided weren't worth the cost. He found room 347. His brother lay unconscious, his chest rising and falling in mechanical time. Jason Morrison raised the pistol. His hands were shaking, but not with fear. With rage. With the specific rage of someone who'd been abandoned by the institution that made him a soldier and then told him to get out of the way. "He doesn't deserve this," Jason said to the empty room. "I won't let him suffer like this." Margaret had stepped out of the room exactly 2 minutes earlier to retrieve fresh dressing supplies. She was returning when she heard the voice. Not a scream. Something worse, the quiet voice of someone who'd already made a decision. She pushed through the door. Jason Morrison stood 6 feet from his brother's bed, the pistol raised, his arms forming an isosceles triangle the way he'd learned in gun safety class 20 years ago, his finger on the trigger, his breath coming in sharp cuts. Margaret didn't think about this part. Thinking was the enemy of movement. She moved. Her body became an equation of speed and angles. 2 steps forward. She placed her body directly between the barrel and the bed. Between the choice and the consequence. "He's not done yet," she said. Her voice had changed, deeper, the voice of someone who'd given orders while other people were screaming. "Your brother survived Fallujah. He'll survive this." Jason's hands wavered. His eyes met hers. For a moment, something flickered in his expression, recognition, maybe. Or just the shock of encountering another human where he'd expected only the absence of one. "He deserves better than a warehouse hospital," Jason said. "He deserves." His hand shook. That was the problem with emotion, it interfered with mechanics. His finger tightened on the trigger and his hands trembled, and the bullet didn't exit in a straight line the way it was supposed to. It didn't hit Margaret in the shoulder with neat efficiency. It tore through her left shoulder at an angle, spinning her against the bed rail, white-hot pain exploding across her entire left side as her scrubs bloomed red. She didn't scream. She didn't fall. She applied pressure to her own wound with her right hand, her eye still on Jason Morrison, her voice still steady even as blood soaked through the cotton fabric. "Put the gun down," she said. "Not a request. Your brother needs you to step back right now." "I'm sorry," Jason whispered. "I'm so sorry." "I know," Margaret said. She was still applying pressure to her shoulder, still standing between the gun and the bed, the pain bright and insistent, bleeding out at a rate she'd have calculated at 5 minutes before shock, 5 minutes before cardiac compromise. "But you need to put it down. Security will be here in 30 seconds. You don't want your brother to watch that." Jason's hands lowered. The gun fell to the floor. By the time security burst through the doors, Margaret was sitting on the floor with her back against the bed rail, still applying pressure to her shoulder, still watching Jason Morrison so that when he realized what he'd done, there was someone there who understood the weight of it. She stood before anyone could help her, muscle memory overriding pain, movement overriding the logical truth that she was bleeding faster than she should be. She walked herself to the emergency room, each step precise, each breath controlled, and only when she'd reached the doors did the room begin to tilt in a way that suggested collapse was going to happen in approximately 6 seconds. The gunshot cracked through the ICU like lightning splitting oak, and the bullet tore through Margaret's left shoulder before her brain registered the sound. The world went white. Then red. Then the color of her own blood spreading across the pale fabric of her scrubs like watercolor bleeding into canvas. She didn't fall. Muscle memory was stronger than pain, stronger than the logical truth screaming at her that a brachial artery wound would kill her in under 4 minutes if the bleeding didn't stop. Her left hand moved on its own, pressing hard against the entry wound, and her right hand, steady as surgical steel, extended toward Jason Morrison, whose face had gone the color of wet concrete. "Jason." Her voice came out flat. Calm. The voice of someone who had talked down armed combatants in the rubble of Fallujah. "I've been shot before. This is nothing." Jason's hands trembled. The pistol hung at his side, his finger still curved around the trigger like it belonged there, like gravity alone might fire it again. His eyes had the hollow look of a man who had already decided he was going to hell and didn't much care how the trip went. "Your brother is stable," Margaret continued, each word precisely measured despite the hot copper taste flooding her mouth. Blood dripped from her elbow onto the linoleum tile. 1 drop. 2 drops. A steady rhythm like a metronome counting down. The fluorescent lights above buzzed their mechanical song, indifferent. "He's going to recover. But if you fire again, Jason, you go to prison and he wakes up alone. Is that what you want?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Jason's shoulders collapsed inward, the gun drooping further. His mouth opened and closed twice without words. 23 years old, Margaret thought. Too young to carry that much rage. Too young to carry that much grief. "If I let him go," Jason whispered, "what happens to him?" "The VA won't cover, they won't even." "Then I'll fight with you," Margaret said, and meant it with every atom of her being. "But not from a prison cell. Your brother needs you alive. He needs you in the fight." The security team materialized like they'd been waiting just beyond the threshold, which, Margaret would later understand, they had been. 2 officers, both moving with the careful precision of men who'd been trained to disarm the armed without adding bodies to the casualty count. One approached from Jason's 9 o'clock. The other held position at his 4. "Jason, I'm Lieutenant Patterson," the one at 9 o'clock said, his voice pitched low and reasonable. "I'm going to ask you to place the weapon on the ground. Nobody gets hurt. You get to walk out of here with options." Jason's hand opened like a flower losing petals. The pistol fell to the tile with a sound like a hammer hitting stone, and Patterson moved forward with the fluid efficiency of long practice, kicking the weapon toward his partner and guiding Jason's wrists into position for restraints that were less about capture than they were about safety. Jason didn't resist. He'd already surrendered somewhere in the space between Margaret's first words and her fourth. Patterson glanced at Margaret, and for just a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe, or the acknowledgement that he'd just watched someone perform a piece of tactical de-escalation that most of his instructors at the academy couldn't pull off under lab conditions. She held his gaze for a single beat, then her knees bent and the room tilted in a way that suggested the next phase of this night was going to involve losing consciousness. Margaret turned toward the corridor, walking with the same steady pace she'd maintained for 40 feet from the vending machine to her patrol route, and now from the ICU toward the emergency department, except this time the cold wasn't just in the air, it was spreading through her bloodstream like winter creeping across the Chesapeake. Her scrubs clung to her chest and shoulder, heavy with blood that had stopped being crimson and started being just weight. Each step was precise. Military bearing. Operational composure. The kind of calm that came from having already survived worse than this, though the logical part of her brain knew that blood loss had a mathematical precision all its own, and she was approximately 2 minutes away from hypertension, 3 minutes away from syncope. The emergency department doors slid open at her approach. The triage nurse looked up from her station and her entire face went rigid. "I need a 14 gauge in my right AC," Margaret said, and her voice was still steady, still flat, still the voice of a field medic reporting vitals rather than requesting critical intervention. "Massive transfusion protocol. I'm estimating 30 to 40% blood volume loss over approximately 8 minutes. Brachial wound. Penetrating trauma." The triage nurse's mouth moved but no words came. The emergency department erupted. Hands materialized. Someone was cutting away her scrubs. Someone else was moving her toward a bay, a stretcher appearing beneath her before she could decide whether falling was acceptable. The pain was information. The pain was data. Margaret's vision narrowed to a pinhole, tunnel vision, her brain explained, a natural response to catastrophic blood loss, and she forced herself to catalog the details with the precision of someone filing an incident report. The ceiling tiles had a water stain in the southeast corner. The ventilation system hummed at approximately 65 decibels. Someone was saying her name, but it sounded like it was coming from very far away, from the other side of a very thick window. "Pressure on the wound, don't remove the hand," she heard herself saying. Or maybe she was just thinking it very loudly. Direct cardiac massage through open chest if her rhythm deteriorates. She can handle it. The room tilted again. This time it kept tilting, rotating on an axis that didn't exist in any normal geometry, and Margaret understood with the clarity of someone whose oxygen saturation was dropping like a stone that the next time she opened her eyes, it would be morning, and the world would have made a series of decisions about her future without her permission. The darkness came on like a switch flipping off. When morning arrived 16 hours later, grey and institutional and filtered through hospital blinds that hadn't been properly adjusted since Tuesday, Margaret opened her eyes to find Dr. Whitfield standing at the foot of her hospital bed, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression arranged into something that almost resembled concern if you weren't looking closely enough to see the calculation underneath it. "Miss Walsh," he said, and his voice had the smooth, practiced tone of a man who'd rehearsed this conversation in front of a mirror. "I wanted to check on you personally. Cedar Creek takes the well-being of our staff very seriously." Margaret's left shoulder was bandaged from collarbone to elbow, and 4 line ran from her right elbow into a saline drip. Her blood pressure cuff inflated automatically every 15 minutes with a sound like a blood pressure cuff inflating automatically every 15 minutes. The wound had required 47 stitches. The bullet had missed her subclavian artery by 0.8 centimeters. Under any other set of circumstances, those details would have felt impressive. Under these circumstances, they felt like details that had been documented for a reason. "You violated critical patient safety protocols," Whitfield continued, settling himself into the visitor's chair as though Margaret had offered him a seat. "When you encountered an armed intruder, you did not immediately evacuate the ICU. You remained in the vicinity of the threat instead of permitting trained security personnel to manage the situation. That decision put 7 patients and 4 staff members at risk." Margaret didn't respond. Her throat felt like someone had poured sand down it, and the pain medication was running a close second to unconsciousness in terms of her brain's functional capacity. She watched Whitfield's face, watching the way his jaw worked, the way his fingers drummed once, twice, 3 times against the armrest before he stopped himself. "I've already called an emergency board meeting," he said. "And I've requested your personnel file and contacted your nursing school references. Cedar Creek's legal department is concerned about liability, and frankly, your behavior last night demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of hospital protocol. I'm placing you on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. You'll be contacted regarding the outcome." He stood. He smoothed his jacket. He turned toward the door with the satisfied expression of a man who had just delivered bad news to someone in a hospital bed and considered it a professional victory. Margaret's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "That wasn't protocol," she said. "That was duty." Whitfield paused at the threshold. He didn't turn around. "Duty to whom, Ms. Walsh? To a patient? To hospital policy? Because from where I'm standing, you've compromised both." The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a period ending a sentence. Outside, Philadelphia rain hammered against the window glass like applause from an audience that understood exactly what had just happened, and exactly how little the people involved understood what was coming next. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a period ending a sentence. Outside, Philadelphia rain hammered against the window glass like applause from an audience that understood exactly what had just happened, and exactly how little the people involved understood what was coming next. Margaret lay in the recovery room 8 hours later, her left shoulder wrapped in surgical dressing so white it seemed to glow against the pale blue hospital gown. And ran into her right arm, the fluid dripping in metronomic rhythm, each drop a small mercy her body couldn't refuse. The shoulder pain was controlled, fentanyl in her system, her mind floating 2 inches above her own thoughts, but the ache underneath was something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with the bullet wound. The door opened without a knock. Dr. Whitfield entered with the casual confidence of a man who had never once questioned his right to walk into any room he chose. He wore the same pressed white coat from this morning, not a wrinkle, not a thread out of place. His tie was silk. His shoes were Italian leather that had probably cost more than Margaret made in a month. He carried a tablet like it was a weapon. "Nurse Walsh." He didn't sit. Standing kept him above her, literally and hierarchically. "We need to discuss your conduct during last night's incident." Margaret blinked at him. The fentanyl was still working. Her thoughts moved slowly, like they were swimming through honey. "You violated 18 separate patient safety protocols by not immediately evacuating," Whitfield continued. "You endangered yourself and potentially compromised the patient's care by remaining in the room during an active threat. Standard procedure is clear. When a weapon is present, nursing staff evacuates. Period." She said nothing. He produced the tablet. "I've already contacted the hospital board. My father-in-law agrees this represents unacceptable judgment on your part. I've also reached out to your nursing school at University of Pennsylvania to verify your training credentials. I'm bringing in an external investigator to review your entire employment history going back to 2008. The words came at her like a slow-motion avalanche. She could see them coming but couldn't move fast enough to dodge. "Your references are being contacted as we speak," he said, watching her face for a crack. "Questions about your reliability, your decision-making under pressure, your overall fitness for this profession." Margaret's jaw clenched once. A small movement, barely visible. Her hands rested motionless on the hospital blanket, one palm up, the four taped to the inside of her wrist. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply looked at him the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand but can't quite focus on. "You are placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation," Whitfield said. "Security will escort you from the premises once you're discharged. You won't return to Cedar Creek until the investigation concludes. If it concludes in your favor, which frankly seems unlikely given the liability exposure here." His hand moved to his tablet screen, swiping through something. "The hospital lawyer is very concerned. Very concerned indeed. Liability. Patient safety. Institutional risk. Those are the words she used. You're a liability now, Nurse Walsh. That changes everything." He said it like he was delivering a diagnosis. Like he was the surgeon and she was the patient on the table with her chest open. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" he asked. Margaret blinked twice, slowly. When she spoke, her voice came out thin and distant, like it was traveling from somewhere very far away. "Yes, doctor." "Good." He turned toward the door. "The discharge papers will be ready within the hour. Security will be waiting at the main entrance. Don't make this difficult." The door closed again. This time it didn't sound like punctuation. It sounded like a cell door locking. Margaret stared at the ceiling tiles for 37 minutes, counting the acoustic holes because her brain needed to do something other than think about what had just happened. The floor dripped. The heart monitor beeped. The ventilator in the next room wheezed its mechanical rhythm like something tired and dying. She was still counting when the discharge nurse came in. 3 hours later, Margaret stood in her kitchen in Philadelphia, still wearing the clothes from last night. The scrubs were blood-stained. Dried dark red across the sleeve where she'd pressed the wound. The fabric was stiff with it. She'd walked out of Cedar Creek Medical in those clothes, watched the security guard, Herbert Chen, the nice one who always smiled, pretend he didn't see her leaving. Watched another security guard follow her to the parking lot without saying anything. Watched herself drive home on autopilot through rain that fell like judgment. Now she sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, her good shoulder shaking in a way she couldn't control. Her breathing came in hitches. The tears just kept coming, and she couldn't make them stop. 15 years. 15 years of steady shifts, reliable charting, patients who asked for her by name, colleagues who trusted her judgment. Gone. Burned down in 5 minutes while she lay in a hospital bed too medicated to defend herself. She heard the front door open. Emma always came home at 4:15 p.m. on Thursdays, but it was only 6 p.m. and the school would have called if she'd left early. Margaret tried to wipe her face, but the tears kept coming, and she gave up. Just sat there at the table with her hands over her face like that was a solution to anything. "Mommy." Emma's voice came from the hallway, confused because Margaret was never home at this time, confused because the front door had been unlocked, confused because she could probably hear her mother crying. "Why are you home early?" Margaret looked up. Her 12-year-old daughter stood in the kitchen doorway in her school uniform, backpack still slung over one shoulder, her face doing that rapid calculation that children do when they're trying to understand why their parent is breaking. "I made a mistake, baby," Margaret said, her voice rough. "I thought I was helping, but I lost my job." Emma didn't move. She was old enough to understand that this was serious but young enough to believe her mother was invincible. "But you saved someone," she said quietly. "You told me that's what nurses do. You told me that's why you do it." Margaret couldn't answer. She just held out her hand, and Emma came around the table and leaned against her mother's side, careful of the bandaged shoulder, and they sat like that while the Philadelphia rain kept falling outside and the kitchen light hummed its fluorescent hum and time moved forward whether anyone was ready or not. 3 days later, Margaret stood in her living room folding laundry, Emma's uniforms, soft and small in her hands, when a sound like thunder shook the windows. Not thunder. Something worse. Something that made her body recognize danger before her conscious mind caught up. She moved to the window. Across the street in Cedar Creek Medical's parking lot, a Black Hawk helicopter descended through the rain, its rotor wash scattering debris in a 100-foot radius, turning the asphalt into a tornado. The aircraft was olive drab with no markings. Military. The kind of aircraft that appeared when something had already gone very wrong. The side doors opened. 6 soldiers emerged in dress uniforms, each movement precise and synchronized, their boots hitting the wet pavement in perfect unison. They formed a single-file line with the kind of military efficiency that came from thousands of hours of training. The lead figure was tall, shoulders broad, moving with the controlled grace of someone accustomed to violence and trained to hide it. A colonel's insignia caught the light. They marched across the street towards Cedar Creek's main entrance like they owned it. Like they had been sent to collect something that belonged to them. Margaret set down the laundry and watched them disappear inside. What happened next took exactly 90 seconds to change everything. Dr. Whitfield was in the middle of a press conference in Cedar Creek's main atrium when the double doors burst open. He was standing before a cluster of local news cameras, talking about enhanced security measures following last week's unfortunate incident, about how Cedar Creek took patient safety seriously, about how they were reviewing protocols. He was smiling. He was in his element. The cameras loved him because he looked like authority. He sounded like power. The colonel entered and stopped. The 6 soldiers formed a line behind him. The cameras swung toward them, then back to Whitfield, then back again, confused about which story was breaking. "Where is Phantom?" The colonel's voice cut through the atrium like a blade through silk. Whitfield's smile faltered. "I'm the chief of surgery here, and I don't know what you're—" "I'm not talking to you." The colonel scanned the crowd of staff and visitors, his eyes moving with tactical precision, looking for something specific. Looking for someone. Herbert Chen stood near the back of the atrium, 74 years old, night security guard, Desert Storm veteran with a medical discharge. His eyes locked on the figure standing just inside the staff entrance. Margaret, still in civilian clothes, still in the same blood-stained scrubs folded under her arm because she'd forgotten them in the locker room. Chen's posture straightened. His hand rose. His voice shook when he spoke. "Master Chief Petty Officer Walsh. You're being recalled." The words echoed through the atrium like a gunshot. Whitfield's face drained of color so completely he looked like someone had removed all his blood in 90 seconds. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "Master Chief? She's a night nurse." "She barely." The colonel stepped forward with his tablet. He didn't acknowledge Whitfield at all. Didn't even look in his direction. He was reading, his voice loud enough for the cameras to pick up every word. Margaret Walsh. Navy Cross for actions in Fallujah, October 2007. He paused. Let that settle. 3 bronze stars with Valor device. Combat action ribbon with 3 stars. The resident physician standing near the elevators stopped breathing. 17 classified operations, the colonel continued, across a 14-month deployment. Saved 43 lives during the Fallujah insurgency. Performed direct cardiac massage through open chest on a convoy under fire. A wheelchair emerged from the crowd. Sergeant Morrison, the Army Ranger from room 347, pushed by his day nurse, his chest still bandaged where a bullet had come in 3 days ago. He raised his hand. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the entire atrium, through the cameras, out into a world that didn't know it was about to change. She took a bullet meant for me 3 days ago, Dr. Whitfield. Same way she took shrapnel for her entire unit in Fallujah. Morrison paused. His hands gripped the wheelchair wheels. I checked the incident report you filed. She stopped the bleeding on herself while talking down an armed combatant. That's what special operations medics do. That's what warriors do. The atrium went silent for exactly 10 seconds. Then Herbert Chen snapped to attention. His hand rose in a trembling salute. An orderly in the corner, army tattoo visible on his forearm, straightened and snapped to attention. A janitor near the elevators, a woman with a Marine Corps ring, stood rigid. A security guard near the bathroom doors. A custodian restocking supplies. Every veteran in the building, hidden in plain sight for years, recognizing what Whitfield had never seen. The cameras captured all of it. The rotor blades shook her windows first. Margaret was folding laundry in her living room when the sound hit, that deep, rhythmic percussion that made the china rattle in the cabinet, that unmistakable signature of a military helicopter cutting through Philadelphia's afternoon sky. She didn't look up immediately. Her hands kept moving, muscle memory folding a fitted sheet with the kind of precision that came from decades of making hospital corners. But the sound grew louder. Closer. The Black Hawk descended towards Cedar Creek Medical's parking lot across the street, its rotor wash flattening the grass, sending papers and debris spiraling into the sky. Margaret finally moved to the window. The helicopter touched down with the controlled violence of a military insertion, and before the rotors had even begun to slow, the doors opened. A full tactical detail emerged, 6 armed personnel in dress uniforms, moving with the coordinated efficiency of operators who'd trained together for years. They crossed the parking lot in formation, boots striking pavement in unison, and disappeared through Cedar Creek's main entrance. She knew. Something in her chest, something older than her conscious mind, recognized the pattern. But she kept folding. One sheet. One blanket. One pillowcase after another, each movement deliberate, controlled, the way she'd controlled her breathing for 15 years every time a doctor looked through her instead of at her. Inside Cedar Creek, Dr. Whitfield was mid-sentence during a press conference about enhanced security measures when the double doors burst open. The colonel entered first, dress blues with insignia that made the hospital administrator's face go pale, flanked by 2 military police whose presence alone seemed to drain the oxygen from the room. The local news cameras swung toward them like weapons tracking a target. Dr. Whitfield. The colonel's voice carried the weight of command authority. I'm Colonel James Harrison, Naval Special Warfare Command. Where is Phantom? The room went dead silent. Whitfield blinked twice, confusion written across his face like blood on white gauze. I'm sorry, I don't understand. Phantom? I think there's been some. Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. The security guard, an elderly veteran with the bearing of someone who'd served, stepped forward from the back of the room. His voice cracked slightly. She's your night shift nurse. Room 347. All eyes shifted to the security camera feeds on the wall monitors. The camera panned to show Margaret's apartment across the street, empty now. The colonel nodded once to the 2 MPs secure the perimeter. She's incoming. Whitfield's face cycled through confusion, concern, and finally something that looked like recognition. Margaret? But she's on administrative leave. I placed her on leave after the incident with the... Yes, we know what you did. The colonel's tone suggested he'd just identified an insect. He opened a tablet, scrolling through documents that glowed with the blue light of classified files. Master Chief Walsh was stationed at Forward Operating Base Prosperity in Fallujah, Iraq, from 2003 to 2008. During that period, she participated in 17 operations classified at the secret level and above. He looked up. She's credited with saving 43 lives. One of the residents gasped. Whitfield's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. The colonel continued reading. 2 of those saves were performed in the back of a moving Humvee while under direct enemy fire. One was open cardiac massage through a left anterolateral thoracotomy using a trauma shears and a suction catheter. He looked directly at Whitfield. She was declared legally dead in 2008 after a black site extraction operation was compromised. Her entire service record was erased to protect ongoing intelligence networks still operating in theater. The hospital administrator sat down slowly. That's impossible. She's just a nurse. She was ordered to disappear, the colonel said. To never surface in any official capacity. She changed her name, moved to Philadelphia, and took night shifts at a teaching hospital for no other reason than she could help people without drawing attention. He paused. The fact that she violated those orders to save your ranger should tell you something about her character. The door at the back of the conference room opened. Margaret stood in the threshold wearing her scrubs, having arrived through the staff entrance with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested she'd planned this approach long before the helicopter landed. She didn't look at Whitfield. She looked at the colonel and nodded once. Master Chief, welcome back to active duty. He returned the nod with military precision. Whitfield stood up. General, Colonel, whatever rank that is, I was simply following standard protocol. When she requested supplies for that patient, when she stepped between him and that armed individual, she violated evacuation procedures. I was protecting the hospital's liability exposure. General Patricia Harmon entered from the side door, and the room's center of gravity shifted. She was a 2-star with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, her uniform crisp as a fresh blade, her eyes the color of storm-heavy Atlantic water. She didn't offer a handshake. She studied Whitfield the way a surgeon examines a biopsy sample under a scope, clinical, precise, interested only in what's malignant. Dr. Whitfield, I'm General Patricia Harmon, Naval Special Warfare Command. Her voice could cut glass. You threatened to have security escort a decorated combat veteran from this building for requesting proper medical supplies. Supplies that likely saved that patient's life. She moved closer, and Whitfield stepped back. You placed her on administrative leave for violating safety protocols after she took a bullet protecting a patient. A bullet meant for him. You called her nursing school references to question her credentials. A woman who performed thoracic surgery in the back of a moving Humvee while under enemy fire. You did all of that. It wasn't a question. I didn't know. Whitfield's voice cracked. How was I supposed to? You weren't supposed to know, Harmon cut him off. That was the point. That was the entire operational security framework. Master Chief Walsh was placed in your hospital to disappear. To be invisible. To help people without drawing attention to her presence or her history. She turned to address the cameras directly. What Dr. Whitfield did was interfere with a protected military asset. He weaponized hospital policy against a war hero because she violated his authority. The word hero hung in the air like a bell that had just rung. Whitfield's face cycled through emotions, anger, fear, desperate calculation, as he watched his colleagues' expressions shift. The residents who'd laughed at his jokes weren't laughing now. They were staring at him like he was something they'd found under a microscope. Your security clearance is hereby revoked, Harmon said, for interfering with a protected military asset. You are permanently barred from treating any service member in any facility that receives federal funding. Which, Dr. Whitfield, is approximately 98% of American hospitals. Whitfield's face went the color of old blood. You can't. I just did. Harmon gestured to the 2 MPs escort Dr. Whitfield from the premises. The same security guards he'd threatened to use against Margaret now took his elbows. Firmly. Not roughly, but with the clear understanding that resistance would only make this worse. They walked him past the cameras, past his colleagues, past the residents who'd trained under him, out through the main entrance where the Black Hawk still idled in the parking lot with its rotors spinning like judgment. Whitfield's father-in-law appeared from the boardroom, confusion on his face. "Patricia, what is the meaning of?" "The meaning is your son-in-law just destroyed his career on national television," Harmon said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. And he did it to himself. The news cameras followed Whitfield to his car. By evening, the footage would be everywhere, the disgraced surgeon being escorted from the building, his hands empty, his face a mask of shock. By morning, his medical board would have called an emergency session. By next week, his name would be in circulation with terms like investigation and preliminary findings. By month's end, he'd be teaching CPR at a community college in Scranton for $15 an hour, his medical license under review, his father-in-law no longer returning his calls. But that was later. That was the mathematics of consequence and time catching up to choices. For now, Margaret walked back to room 347 as the sun painted the windows gold. Sergeant Morrison was awake, coherent, his prognosis upgraded to full recovery. She checked his vitals with the same precision she'd used for 15 years, blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation, each number a small confirmation that he would live. "You came back," Morrison said. "You needed a night nurse." Margaret adjusted his full line, the movement smooth as water. "That hasn't changed." On the window ledge beside his bed, she placed the pair of worn combat boots she'd carried out of Fallujah in her pack. They'd been wrapped in plastic for 15 years, hidden in the bottom of her hospital locker. Now she unwrapped them, setting them where the late afternoon light could finally touch them. The leather was creased from years in the sand. The soles were worn smooth from walking on patrol routes and running toward gunfire. They were the most honest things in the room. Emma visited after school, her face flushed with the kind of pride that only a daughter feels when she finally understands that her mother is not ordinary. Margaret's medals now hung in a shadow box in the hallway at home, no longer hidden. A Bronze Star. A second Bronze Star. A third. Each one a small confirmation of something she'd never needed to tell anyone. The Navy Cross. And underneath, a citation that read in part, "For extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy of the United States." The hospital administrator personally apologized, offered Margaret a promotion to Director of Emergency Services with a salary that would have changed her life 6 months ago. She declined. "I'm a night nurse," Margaret said. "That's where I do my best work." Herbert Chen told her over coffee the next morning that Whitfield was indeed teaching CPR classes at a community college in Scranton. The classes were poorly attended. His ratings were abysmal. The community college was considering not renewing his contract. Margaret didn't smile at the news. Didn't celebrate. Just nodded once, and changed the subject to a patient's lab work. That night, as Margaret finished her rounds, a young resident approached nervously. She was one of the ones who'd laughed during grand rounds. She looked like she hadn't slept. "Master Chief Walsh? I wanted to apologize for laughing. During grand rounds. I didn't know." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. The resident held her breath. "You still shouldn't have laughed," Margaret said finally. "You didn't need to know my history to know that cruelty was wrong." The resident nodded, chastened. Waited. "But you're here now," Margaret said, her voice softening slightly. "That counts for something." She walked toward the staff exit as the night transitioned to dawn, her footsteps echoing on the tile floor. The night cleaning crew, 3 veterans among them, nodded as she passed. Margaret paused at the door, turned back to face the empty hallway, the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical song above her head. "Power is not a title," she said to no one in particular. "Power is the ability to help." She pushed through the exit into the morning light, her boots carrying her forward, just as they had for 15 years. just as they would for the rest of her life. Like and subscribe if you believe nurses deserve more respect. And tell me honestly, what would you have done in her shoes? I'm pinning the best answer.